Hey everybody. I want to start by apologizing for the way this video may look at times. You are going to want to, if you can, right, have the myth of Sisyphus with you. There are some highlighted portions that I'm going to be talking about, and I am going to look very odd in this video because I'm going to be going between a couple different screens so I can talk about the book. And the most important thing to think about, maybe the biggest question that you've got is, we had the existentialism is a humanism. We didn't do much citation from it, right? And I think that's because there is a great deal that can be simply gleaned from the way that Sartre presents things and what we can pull from it. For the myth of Sisyphus, for talking about the absurd, I really do want to be a lot more clear, because this is, as much as existentialism is an important point of view, the absurd is a philosophy that really informs a lot of what we are going to be talking about for the second half of the semester, right? A big part of that. As we are going to be looking at these plays, we are going to be talking about both the absurd and existentialism. We're going to be talking about the way people exist, their responsibility in what they do, the choices that they're going to be making. But we are also dealing with this idea of the absurd, and it's really important to define it. And I want to start with a specific quote that actually comes from around page 10 in the PDF that I'm sending to you. And it's a highlighted section. And I'm going to read this little paragraph in its entirety because this is the definition for me, right, that we are looking at that is the most important. So, here we go. If I accuse an innocent man of a monstrous crime, if I tell a virtuous man that he has coveted his own sister, he will reply that this is absurd. His indignation has its comical aspect, but it also has its fundamental reason. The virtuous man illustrates by that reply the definitive antinomy existing between the deed I am attributing to him and his lifelong principles. It's absurd means it's impossible, but also it's contradictory. If I see a man armed only with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd. But it is so solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intention and the reality he will encounter. Of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. Likewise, we shall deem a verdict absurd when we contrast it with the verdict the facts apparently dictated. And similarly, a demonstration by the absurd is achieved by comparing the consequences of such a reasoning with the logical reality one wants to set up. In all these cases, from the simplest to the most complex, the magnitude of the absurdity will be in direct ratio to the distance between the two terms of my comparison. There are absurd marriages, challenges, rancors, silences, wars, and even peace treaties. This is the important part, so this is really where we get our bulk of our definition of the absurd. For each of them, the absurdity springs from a comparison. I am thus justified in saying that the feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression, but that it bursts from the comparison between a bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. So, what we are looking at, right, is the absurd as comparison more than anything else. The idea of the absurd, right, is that there are truly humorous things that we refer to as absurd, right? When we look at, a lot of cartoons, for example, the absurdity of a Tom and Jerry is that this tiny mouse often bests, right, this large cat in absolutely ridiculous ways, and the comparison of the size the comparison of the size, and then the comparison of the actions, right? The one very small mouse being able to easily overcome a large cat after, right, being, beaten by the cat for most of the cartoon, right, that's what is absurd, right? We can find it to be humorous, but we also will find the absurd to be utterly problematic for us, right? This comparison of where we are and the things that we want to do, right? The reply of, right, the world to us. So I want to start there. We're going to continue building on this, right, as we move forward, but that is the number one thing we want to talk about when we talk about the myth of Sisyphus and the absurd in general, is that the comparison is where the absurd comes from. The absurd is not necessarily in an action, which in and of itself, if simply done with no context, is an action like any other action. For example, me deciding to have a cup of coffee, completely normal. Me deciding to have a cup of coffee in the middle of a battleground, appearing to be unbothered by it, right, is absurd. Camus expands that to say, our living life is in and of itself a normal action, right? An action that everybody has. But our living our lives in the middle of a world that does not respond to our needs, according to Camus, right? That does everything it can to stifle us, is an absurd situation, right? Life itself, not necessarily terribly absurd. Our living, right, not necessarily absurd, but that comparison, that confrontation of the two produces this absurdity. And we will expand upon this in our next video.